Stretch a rubber band between your hands and bring it close to heat. Most materials would soften, their atoms would move faster, their internal forces would weaken, and under tension, they would begin to stretch farther apart. But the rubber band contracts. Inside it, millions of long molecular chains are trying to return to their tangled state. It is a small, almost invisible reaction. Yet this strange behavior helps explain why rubber became one of the most important materials in the modern world. A typical car contains hundreds of rubber components. Most are hidden inside seals, hoses, belts, electrical insulation, and vibration-absorbing parts. Without them, the machine would leak, overheat, shake itself apart, and eventually stop moving. During the Second World War, this dependence became a matter of national survival. Modern armies required rubber for trucks, aircraft, communication cables, medical equipment, and millions of tires. When the great plantations of Southeast Asia were cut off, the United States invested billions of modern dollars in an emergency effort to manufacture synthetic alternatives. The gamble succeeded, but only partly. Even today, synthetic rubber cannot perfectly reproduce every strength of the material produced by a tree. Under extreme tension, natural rubber can reorganize its molecular chains and strengthen itself at the very moment it is being pulled apart. The man who helped make this unstable tree sap reliable enough for modern industry would die deeply in debt. His name was Charles Goodyear. Decades later, that name would appear on millions of tires, while the material he transformed became indispensable to factories, vehicles, armies, and empires. Rubber could stretch without breaking. Human ambition would be pushed far beyond that limit. Long before rubber entered factories, it was already being shaped in Mesoamerica. By around 1600 BCE, communities in what is now southern Mexico were collecting milky latex from Castilla elastica trees and mixing it with juice from morning glory vines. The combination made the material less brittle and more elastic. From it, they formed solid balls that bounced across stone courts, along with figurines, bands, and ritual objects. To later European observers, this seemed almost impossible. A black substance that could strike the ground, deform, and spring back into the air. But this was not a primitive curiosity waiting to be discovered by outsiders. It was the result of generations of experimentation with plants, chemistry, and proportion. Thousands of years before Charles Goodyear heated rubber with sulfur, indigenous makers had already learned that latex could be transformed, and that different mixtures could produce different strengths. When European travelers encountered rubber in the Americas, they carried the material home as a curiosity. It could erase pencil marks, repel water, and stretch in ways familiar materials could not. Inventors soon coated cloth with it to make waterproof shoes, coats, and bags, while merchants imagined an entirely new industry. For a brief moment, rubber seemed almost miraculous. Then summer arrived. In warm weather, untreated rubber softened into a sticky, foul-smelling mass that clung to skin and fabric. In winter, the same products hardened, cracked, and became nearly useless. Manufacturers watched warehouses fill with ruined goods, and customers returned shoes and coats that had lost their shape. Rubber possessed the qualities industry wanted: flexibility, waterproofing, and resilience, but only within a narrow range of temperatures. Before it could transform transportation or machinery, someone would have to solve the contradiction hidden inside the material itself. Charles Goodyear entered this problem with little scientific training, almost no financial security, and an obsession that would consume the rest of his life. He mixed rubber with powders, acids, metals, and drying agents, often working in borrowed rooms while his debts mounted. According to the famous account, a mixture containing rubber and sulfur fell onto a hot surface in 1839. Instead of melting, it charred around the edges, but remained flexible. The moment may have been dramatized later, yet it revealed the principle Goodyear had been pursuing through years of experiments. Heat and sulfur could create links between the material's long molecular chains. The process, later called vulcanization, prevented rubber from flowing in summer or becoming uselessly brittle in winter. Goodyear received a United States patent in 1844. At last, rubber could survive the temperatures, pressure, and repeated movement demanded by industrial machines. The breakthrough did not rescue Goodyear from poverty. Vulcanization created an industry, but it also triggered years of legal battles over patents in the United States and Europe. Goodyear spent heavily defending his claims, borrowed constantly, and struggled to turn technical success into personal wealth. When he died in 1860, he was deeply in debt, even as manufacturers were beginning to profit from the process he had helped perfect. 38 years later, businessman Frank Seiberling founded a tire company and named it Goodyear in his honor, though Charles Goodyear had no connection to the business. By then, rubber was moving far beyond waterproof coats and shoes. Factories used it in belts, valves, seals, and electrical insulation. Yet the greatest expansion was still ahead. Once engineers placed air-filled rubber around the wheel, demand would no longer grow by the workshop or factory. It would grow with every road, bicycle, automobile, and city. The pneumatic tire transformed rubber from a useful industrial material into a product demanded on a massive scale. In 1888, John Boyd Dunlop patented a practical air-filled tire after fitting one to his son's tricycle, creating a smoother ride than solid rubber could provide. The idea spread quickly through the bicycle boom of the 1890s, when speed, comfort, and road grip suddenly depended on flexible tubes and durable outer casings. Automobile manufacturers soon adopted the same principle, but cars consumed far more rubber than bicycles. Every vehicle required multiple tires, replacements after wear, and additional rubber hidden in hoses, belts, seals, and electrical insulation. Roads expanded, cities grew, and motor transport began reshaping trade and daily life. Rubber was no longer merely one material among many. It had become the soft component, holding together the hardest machines of the industrial age. As demand exploded, attention turned toward the Amazon, where wild rubber trees grew across vast stretches of rainforest. Unlike plantation crops arranged in neat rows, these trees stood far apart, forcing workers to travel long routes through dense forest each day. They cut shallow grooves into the bark, collected the white latex in small cups, and smoked it over fires until it hardened into dark, heavy balls. From remote river settlements, the rubber moved toward booming cities such as Manaus and Belém, where merchants built theaters, mansions, and electric tramways from the profits. But the wealth visible in these cities concealed the system beneath it. Many rubber tappers received food, tools, and transport on credit, then discovered that inflated debts kept them permanently tied to their employers. The forest produced an extraordinary material, but distance, debt, and isolation allowed those controlling trade to control the people collecting it. The debt system could easily become something far more violent. In the Putumayo region, where the borders of Peru and Colombia remained contested, companies forced indigenous communities to meet rubber quotas they had never agreed to. Traders called the arrangement commerce, but debts were manipulated, workers were prevented from leaving, and armed overseers punished villages that delivered too little. Hostages were taken, people were flogged, and food production collapsed as more time was demanded for collecting latex. The Peruvian Amazon Company, linked to businessman Julio Cesar Arana, turned this remote forest into an extraction zone, governed by fear. Rubber leaving the region, entered markets as an ordinary commodity, its origin hidden behind shipping documents and accounts. The prosperity of distant cities depended on a brutal separation. Consumers saw tires, cables, and waterproof goods, while the people gathering the raw material saw quotas, rifles, and debt. Across the Atlantic, rubber became the engine of an even larger system of terror. From 1885 to 1908, King Leopold II ruled the Congo Free State as his personal possession, granting vast territories to companies that demanded ever higher rubber quotas. Villages were ordered to send men into the forest, while wives and children were sometimes held hostage until the required amount returned. The force publique enforced the system with beatings, executions, and the burning of homes. Severed hands became one of its most infamous symbols, partly because soldiers were required to account for the ammunition they used. Rubber profits flowed toward Europe, while Congolese communities lost labor, food production, security, and lives. The material that made bicycles smoother and factories more efficient was now being collected through organized violence. In Congo, rubber was no longer simply extracted from trees. It was extracted from human fear. The brutality of the rubber booms revealed how difficult wild production was to control. Trees stood scattered across forests, harvests depended on long journeys, and merchants relied on coercion to force more latex from the land. The British Empire wanted a system that could be measured, managed, and expanded. In 1876, Henry Wickham collected 70,000 seeds from Hevea brasiliensis trees near the Amazon and shipped them to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. Only a small fraction germinated, but the seedlings were enough. They were sent to Ceylon, Malaya, and colonies, where officials and planters began turning a forest tree into a plantation crop. Wickham later portrayed the operation as a daring escape, although historians question how secret it truly was. Whatever the drama, the result was enormous. Control of rubber was beginning to move from South American forests into the organized machinery of empire. In Malaya and Ceylon, rubber was no longer scattered through a forest. It stood in disciplined rows. Colonial botanists selected productive trees, refined tapping methods, and taught planters how to harvest latex without killing the crop. Railways and ports carried the output toward European factories, while estates recruited migrant workers from India and China to clear land, plant seedlings, and tap trees for low wages. The new system was far more efficient than wild collection, because every acre, worker, and shipment could be measured. By the early 20th century, Asian plantations were overtaking the Amazon and reshaping the global rubber trade. But efficiency came with a cost. Diverse landscapes became monocultures. Workers grew dependent on estate housing and labor contracts, and the world's supply of an essential material became concentrated in one colonial region, thousands of miles from the industries that depended on it. The concentration of rubber production in colonial Asia alarmed American manufacturers, especially Henry Ford, whose factories depended on a material controlled by distant plantations. In 1927, Ford acquired 2.5 million acres beside Brazil's Tapajós River and began building Fordlandia, a company town intended to supply his automobile empire with cheap, independent rubber. Houses, a hospital, a power station, and even a golf course rose from the rainforest. But Ford tried to impose industrial order on an ecosystem he barely understood. Rubber trees that survived when scattered through the forest were planted close together in neat rows, allowing insects and leaf disease to spread rapidly. Workers also resisted rigid schedules and unfamiliar rules imported from Michigan. Fordlandia consumed money for nearly 2 decades without creating the secure supply Ford imagined. The experiment revealed an uncomfortable truth. Factories could standardize machines, but they could not easily standardize a rainforest. Fordlandia failed, but the danger Ford feared soon became real. By the early 1940s, the United States consumed enormous quantities of rubber while producing almost none of its own. Most arrived from plantations in Southeast Asia. After Japan captured major producing territories in 1942, American access to roughly 90% of its natural rubber supply disappeared. The remaining stockpile could not sustain civilian transport and mechanized war for long. Tires were rationed, driving was restricted, and citizens were urged to surrender old hoses, boots, and inner tubes for reclamation. Rubber had become as strategically important as fuel or steel. Trucks could not carry troops without tires. Aircraft could not land safely. Engines, cables, masks, and medical equipment all depended on flexible seals and insulation. The plantation system had delivered cheap abundance, but its geographic concentration had created a vulnerability capable of immobilizing an entire nation. The response was one of the largest emergency industrial programs of the war. Government laboratories, oil companies, universities, and the major tire manufacturers were pushed into cooperation, sharing research that would normally have remained protected by patents. Their main solution was GRS, a synthetic rubber made largely from styrene and butadiene, chemicals derived from petroleum and industrial alcohol. New factories had to be designed, built, and supplied, while the war was already consuming material faster than it could be replaced. Within only a few years, the United States transformed synthetic rubber from a limited specialty product into a mass-produced strategic resource. It was not identical to natural rubber, and engineers had to redesign compounds for different uses. But it kept trucks moving, aircraft operating, and military production alive. A tropical tree had forced an industrial nation to create an entirely new chemical infrastructure. Synthetic rubber saved the war effort, but it did not make the rubber tree obsolete. Natural rubber is built mainly from long chains of cis-1,4-polyisoprene. When the material is pulled hard, those tangled chains align and form temporary crystalline regions, reinforcing the rubber at the moment it is under greatest stress. Synthetic polyisoprene can imitate the same chemistry, but small differences in molecular regularity and non-rubber components can reduce how quickly and effectively that reinforcement occurs. This matters in heavy-duty tires, aircraft components, and other applications repeatedly exposed to extreme loads. Yet synthetic rubber has advantages of its own. Styrene butadiene can resist abrasion, while nitrile performs better against many oils and chemicals. Modern rubber products therefore rely on engineered blends. The wartime program did not defeat nature. It revealed that industry could copy parts of rubber's behavior, but not every advantage of the living tree. Rubber's next transformation took place not on roads or battlefields, but inside hospitals. During the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s, new infection control rules made disposable gloves essential for far more medical procedures. Demand for latex gloves surged, and factories expanded rapidly to supply them. But the solution created another danger. Natural latex contains proteins that can trigger allergic reactions, especially when glove production leaves too much of them behind. In powdered gloves, those proteins could attach to the powder and become airborne whenever workers pulled the gloves on or off. Nurses, doctors, and technicians inhaled the particles repeatedly through entire shifts, and some developed rashes, asthma, or severe hypersensitivity. Nitrile gloves offered an alternative. They contained no natural latex proteins, and often resisted oils and harsh chemicals better. Once again, industry had solved one problem only, by revealing another hidden weakness in the material. Today, the natural rubber economy no longer belongs mainly to kings, colonial companies, or automobile pioneers. It rests on millions of small farms spread across Southeast Asia, where families tap trees before sunrise and sell latex into a market they rarely control. Around 90% of global production comes from smallholders, yet their incomes rise and fall, with prices set far beyond their villages. When prices collapse, farmers delay replanting, reduce fertilizer, or abandon rubber entirely. When demand rises, companies and governments encourage expansion into new land. The same decentralized system that supports millions of livelihoods also makes the supply chain difficult to trace. A tire may pass through traders, processors, exporters, and manufacturers before reaching a road, while the farmer who produced its raw material receives only a small and unstable share of its final value. The old distance between profit and labor remains. The greatest threat may come from the system's biological and environmental weakness. Most natural rubber is produced from a single species, concentrated heavily in one region of the world. Drought, extreme rainfall, rising temperatures, or a major plant disease could reduce harvests across entire producing countries. Expanding plantations can also replace forests and wildlife habitat, while the finished product creates another form of damage far from the farm. Every time a tire rolls across asphalt, friction releases microscopic particles of rubber, fillers, and chemical additives into the air, soil, and waterways. These particles are difficult to collect because they are produced gradually, across billions of journeys. Rubber once appeared to solve the problem of movement by absorbing impact and gripping the road. But at modern scale, the same wear that makes transportation possible is spreading the material invisibly through the environment. There is no single replacement for the rubber system the world has built. Researchers are breeding more resilient hevea trees, while farmers are experimenting with agroforestry that mixes rubber with other crops instead of clearing land for uniform plantations. Companies are also under pressure to trace latex back to individual farms, reduce deforestation, and prevent labor abuses hidden behind layers of traders. Far from Southeast Asia, scientists are developing alternative sources, such as guayule, a drought-tolerant desert shrub capable of producing natural rubber without tropical plantations. Engineers are testing longer-lasting tires, safer chemical additives, recycling methods, and processes that break the sulfur bonds created during vulcanization so old rubber can be reused. Each solution, however, faces limits of cost, scale, quality, or infrastructure. The problem is not that humanity lacks alternatives. It is that the existing system is cheap, precisely because many of its real costs remain invisible. Stretch the rubber band again, and bring it close to heat. It still pulls inward, its molecular chains struggling to return to disorder. The reaction looks simple, because everything behind it has been pushed out of sight. Indigenous knowledge, failed inventions, ruined forests, colonial plantations, wartime laboratories, migrant workers, highways, hospitals, and billions of tires slowly wearing into the environment. Rubber helped build the modern world not because it was merely flexible, but because it could survive repeated pressure without immediately breaking. Civilization learned to depend on that strength, then built an enormous system around securing, transforming, and consuming it. The material continues to hold together vehicles, machines, medical equipment, and global trade. But the system surrounding it is being stretched by unstable prices, climate change, disease, labor abuses, and pollution. Rubber can recover its shape after being pulled. Whether the world built upon it can do the same remains uncertain. Subscribe for more hidden histories behind the ordinary materials shaping our lives.